Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. It's program number 752, and it's May the 5th, 1985. This is a one-hour analysis of news, and I suggest that you tape record it when you have a chance. And before I get running along with information and run out of time, I want to tell you that you can write to me, Mae, M-A-E, Brussell, just like it sounds, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel, California, 93922, and I will send you a bibliography sheet from this or other broadcasts with the sources of information that I'm citing in case you want to look them up for yourself and have those particular articles or books, the titles that I recommend. Regarding the nuclear plant explosion in the Soviet Union this week, I don't want to spend too much time on it. It's been covered a lot in the media, but I do want to suggest the idea of a possible sabotage. I believed from the way the event took place and the covering of the event that there could be a sabotage against the Soviet Union, and it was selected for this particular time. You remember Reinhard Gehlen, the chief of Hitler's Eastern intelligence, was given $20 million by Allen Dulles in the 1950s to start literally a war against the Soviet Union to heat up for World War III, and his specialty as Hitler's chief of intelligence was the Eastern Division. Allen Dulles also was working with Edwin Wilson. I'm going into more about Wilson later, but in the 1950s, 1956, Dulles was meeting with Edwin Wilson in Las Vegas, Nevada, and Wilson was to work with security of the U-2 planes that would be over the Soviet Union. But the expertise of Reinhard Gehlen was that he had agents inside the Soviet Union as well as everywhere else in Eastern Europe, and they could be nurturing for occasions such as this. I remember when Marina Oswald met Lee Harvey Oswald, it was through the Alexander Zeiger family, Z-I-G-E-R, and all this information comes from the Warren Commission hearings themselves that were published in 1964. And she was a czarist from a white Russian family, and Mr. Zeiger was from Argentina. And at the time the Warren Commission was doing their work, Isaac Don Levine, who was an agent of the OSS and CIA, had asked the Warren Commission to have the CIA move the daughters of the Zeiger family to Argentina, and this was in 1964 before the Warren Report was even published. I wrote about that in Rebel magazine in 1983. But the point is that Lee Harvey Oswald worked at the Minsk radio factory, and as I stated before, had been associated at 3 locations where the U-2 planes were being put together or leaving from those places, and later the U-2 downed the summit, what would be a peace conference between Nikita Khrushchev and President Eisenhower, again sabotaged by Allen Dulles, who was working, of course, with Edwin Wilson. And just continue along those lines, about 6 months ago or more, I talked about a book called Out of the Night by Jean Valton, and this was a great anti-Soviet book. He was an escapee from a Soviet prison, and then it turned out that Valton was at San Quentin prison and was wanted on a murder charge in California. And when he was released and went to Russia or Eastern Europe or just Europe, he came back with a manuscript that Isaac Don Levine helped write, which was a strong Cold War, hot war. It was a great critique of Soviet prisons, and it turned out to be a prison in California that he had been writing about. Now, many of the Punamon space scientists that came over here on Project Paperclip, the rocket scientists, a good deal of them went to the Soviet Union. They helped put up Sputnik before the United States could get such a feat going. They've had space stations up there for a year, and they have great accomplishments. But how do we know that the SS, the members of the SS, and the Sputnik Project Paperclip scientists that came to this country and the others split with Russia do not have their allegiance, which was the oath of the SS, to a Fourth Reich, to a 1,000-year Reich? And do you really believe that all of Hitler's Nazis that worked at Punamon and Dora that split with the ones that came to America for the race to Star Wars and so forth, do you really think in their minds that they favor the Soviet Union, or again, like the serpent's sake, have they been nurtured to do not only what they did now, possibly, but to do more harm? Now, the fifth point about this is that the Soviet Union has been pleading with space talks about Star Wars, with summit meetings based upon the fact of shelving Star Wars, where Ronald Reagan and Edward Teller and Secretary of Navy John Lehman know that Star Wars is a first strike capability. And Lehman talked on the Ted Koppel show about how to start World War III in the North Sea, attack the Soviet Union. We're talking war, we're talking attack, we're using Star Wars, and the Soviets want to stop the Star Wars project. And as soon as the nuclear explosion took place in Russia, Bonn, Germany officials were telling them, now you stop your nuclear activity. At a time where we are contracting and giving out money, so much money that when Reagan's out of office, it won't matter who's president, and start rolling this Star Wars contracts as if they haven't been doing it for 40 years, move it along so it's acceptable by people around the world, but tell Russia, you're careless, you can't have that capability. Now, the United States has gone economically broke. It has doubled its debt in 5 years since Ronald Reagan was president, but for 40 years we have built up this $2 trillion debt. And at a time when the summit is coming, it's an economic summit, an annual one in Japan of 7 major nations. The United States is literally bankrupt, can hardly pay the interest on its debts, illegally borrowed from Social Security funds last year in order for Ronald and Nancy to make the trip to Europe. And so now that there's an economic summit coming, Reagan and the powers that be at the Pentagon are the greatest diversionaries from the real issues. And what will be the issues at the summit? They'll talk about terrorism and they'll talk about the Russian nuclear plant, because they seem like the overriding issues and take a lot of space away from the real hard facts of the economy. The real hard facts of the economy are the trade problems, and also the stock market dropped 41% this week, and that's just the beginning of what's going to happen to the economy. It's going to get worse. So while the Soviet nuclear plant blows up, we tell the Russians, Germany says, don't make a nuclear plant, stop, in effect, making plutonium, stop your nuclear activities, you're a menace and a danger. And just of April 1986, Germany signed their deal with us with the Star Wars. Israel was the first country to sign, in Japan. So the old Nazi axis only, this time it is Germany, America, and Japan together contracting Star Wars, and the plant in Russia just conveniently catches fire at a time preceding the summit. Now, who in Russia is asking the United States to help them with the fire? I read that they asked for help from Germany. Are those the old Punamunda scientists? I can't believe that the KGB and the Russian intelligence and the Russian military and the expertise on space can't put out a fire or don't have contingencies for fire in the event it's going to take place. They are great scientists with this kind of thing, and I don't know why they would let their guard down to ask the Germans to come in unless the invitation to come help us put out the fire from the United States and from Germany are the German scientists, the equivalent of the ones at Muscle Shoals, Alabama, the rocket scientists that gave the orders to go up to let the shuttle go, even though the Challenger would most probably disintegrate, particularly in that coldest day ever. So who in Russia is saying, help us, and inviting into Russia under the guise of scientists? Were they invited by the other Punamundora people? You have to ask the question because of the timing and the circumstances of the way this is taking place. Another reason I'm so suspicious of this event happening now is the way the news media pounced on it. They didn't treat it as a tragedy that would affect all of us. They treated us as if this old enemy, the media, from the TV, the articles, the editorials, were identical to when the Korean airline went down. Now, we were told last week that Mr. Wick of the CIA, U.S. Information Agency, and the American radio propaganda media were told in advance of the bombing of Libya, so immediately after the airplanes left, they could tell the Libyan people how bad Gaddafi was. America loves them, but that they have to get rid of Gaddafi and everything will be fine. Now, this same kind of synchronized editorials and TV and radio talk shows, I just can't believe that people would come in on a tragedy. It didn't happen with Bhopal. It didn't happen when the Challenger blew up. And remember, when the Challenger blew up, the evidence came out that the next shuttle to go up would have plutonium, this deadly plutonium that I talked about, and nobody was worried about our real irresponsibility or the secret that they knew that these rocket boosters might fail and could fail and should, because they were taking money from their safety and putting it away, billions, so that they could put in a side drawer for the Star Wars later. And the plutonium could be spilled on specific countries. They wouldn't name which ones, but hinted it. It could be used as a weapon. It could be as an excuse for emergency police dictatorship that Reagan has built up, that I cited before, the Federal Emergency Management and so forth. But the way the media handled it and the timing made me very suspicious, because the economic summit is a very serious thing, and we are probably in worse shape than any of the 7 countries going to the economic summit, and Ronald Reagan is personally responsible for the disaster that is happening. And he knew that this book would come out of David Stockman's, that we don't know beans about money, and this country is not run by people who are logical or skilled at the problems. And so what better way to pull out some of Galen's agents or Hitler's past agents and decide this is a time to put Russia behind and make them look like they are polluting the world. The Los Angeles Times had a story this week by Jack Nelson. Reagan ready to head for Tokyo. Schultz shows irritation on Asian policy issues. And just briefly, it tells about the president's trip that was jarred by continuous economic and political differences in Asia with the non-aligned countries, and discussions went to terrorism and the Soviets' nuclear disaster, which is likely to dominate the agenda of the 12th Economic Summit. Well, maybe that's what they want, that the nuclear take over, the terrorism, which George Shultz has pinpointed to the Soviet Union as being responsible for all terrorism, and now this nuclear explosion will dominate the agenda, and Reagan, who can't do anything but read little cards anyway, will pass the buck, and they'll get off on these other subjects that all point to the Soviet Union. The news of the nuclear disaster, according to Jack Nelson in the Times, and the administration's attempt to respond to it without adequate information, overshadowed Reagan's 3-day visit so far, and there's a shadow over Tokyo when 7 major industrial democracies meet. And then the article goes on the eve of Reagan's departure from Bali for Tokyo, George Shultz was exasperated. He was fenced with reporters over Southeast Asian policy differences. He's irritated with their policies, not ours, and he's expressed irritation at the Soviets for failing to provide more information about Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Now, we provided no information on the John Kennedy assassination, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. True, 3 Mile Island didn't explode, but we have had no information about nuclear waste that Ronald Reagan stopped from being cleaned up for political reasons, so it wouldn't appear that Jerry Brown and other Democrats had a successful cleanup during their administration. We have had more deaths from nuclear pollution in this country, but we keep throwing this anger to the Soviet Union, so it's a good way to let the summit the meeting in Tokyo be about terrorism and the Russians and the nuclear explosion. And for all purposes, the fire is out, and if you save the articles for the past 7 days, you know it could have been very dangerous, and quite a few people were affected, but not as many people affected as by other things right in our environment here, which you don't know about, which you are eating, which they are selling to you and poisoning you. And that is the way we attack Russia and not look at ourselves. Many articles, as I say, secrecy shrouds the extent of the loss. Mary McGrory wrote Mikhail Gorbachev's image and meltdown, and they are tearing him apart, and they get in on the act. The so-called liberal writers, forget the fascists like William Buckley and the others, but the liberals like Mary McGrory want to come in and attack the Soviet Union. Well, we had an example of the so-called liberals attacking Libya and Gaddafi several weeks ago. They all got on the bandwagon. One of them got off the bandwagon this week. This was Richard Goodwin. I don't know if you saw his article. It was reprinted in the LA Times, and it's very significant how the so-called left or liberal or the thinking or the caring people are totally ignoring statistics and facts and getting in this groundswell of Ronald Reagan, Goebbels' propaganda instead of separating these events from their own minds. And Richard Goodwin wrote an article this week titled, "Fervor Gives Way to Reason on Libya. The Raid Was Wrong." Now, he is apologizing for what he wrote several weeks ago. William Buckley, several years later, apologized for defending the the Argentine military junta and the death squads, and apologized for getting in on that fervor of defending Argentina. I just want to cite a few sentences of Richard Goodwin because they're so important. He said, writing for this page, just after we bombed Libya, I expressed some justification for the raid. And I was really shocked that he did it at the time. He said, I was mistaken. I was caught up by patriotic righteousness of the moment. We finally showed the bastards, in quotes. I did not pause for the imaginative reflection that now persuades me that the raid was a serious error in moral terms and in foreign policy. In the days that followed the raid, there were two immediate stimuli to reconsideration. First, there was the awareness that Libyan civilians were injured, made homeless. There was this horror from the skies. The people were not terrorists. They didn't choose their leader necessarily any more than West Germany, those people that dropped the bomb on the discotheque, knew or were familiar with the policies of Libya, and they were doing something that was unfamiliar to them, but they did it. It was wrong. And he said the only offense of the people being born in Libya, and their vulnerability was being poor citizens of a weak third world country. The second source of second sight was the obscene spectacle of an American president grinning in triumph as he boasted that we had shown that we meant business and ebulliently threatened to do it again, this time Iran and Syria. And remember that face at Grenada and how he went back for the victory celebration, the face, and Caspar Weinberger always pointing to his charts and maps to justify what he was doing. And Richard Goodwin says, a wise man does not exult in his power to destroy. It is not bravery to order a handful of American pilots against a small and relatively defenseless country from the comfortable security of a fortified continent. It is an abdication of leadership to arouse and misdirect the frustrated anger of Americans by equating it with an act of revenge with the purposeful expression of national will. In a violent world, we must occasionally act with violence, but it is nothing to brag about. And when the act is without risk to those who command it, there is no courage. It is not strength, but weakness that speaks the unwillingness to face up to the harsh realities. He says, Americans find it difficult to accept that there are problems in this world with no quick solution, that there is danger in our power and wealth, and we have to be careful. And he apologized. He said, America once seemed to promise so much. Our abdication has aroused intense hostilities. It may not seem fair, but nations, like people, are judged by their pretensions, and we pronounced ourselves ally to the wretched of the earth, having abandoned that alliance, one that was wise and moral and just. We are inflicting on our own future a wound far more serious than the feeble blows on terrorists. He apologized then, and I believe if you give time to the stories of that nuclear reactor, and if they investigate it properly, they will find that all this coming down on Russia for polluting the earth and endangering the lives of people and children is something that could have happened to us and could have been triggered at this particular moment. The Challenger's out of the news, Libya's out of the news. This week it is the nuclear reactor in the Soviet Union, and next week it will be something else. One quick item about Mr. Waldheim that was in the newspapers, the New York Times this week, May the 2nd. They found a book in which he wrote about the killings and the ordering of people to be murdered. As a first lieutenant in the Army's group, he kept a book. And the interesting thing about the book, written by Waldheim, July 19th to August 21st, 1923, he was assigned to the German General Staff Liaison, attached to the Italian 11th Army in northwest Greece. And there's an index in the book that bears his name. and these and other German war documents were found in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. They've been there, and the documents have been available for public domain since the mid-60s, and it was only when it came to light that he was going to be president of Austria, that the former UN chief had served in the Balkans, and then a Robert Herzstein, Herzstein, professor at the University of South Carolina, found these documents about the atrocities, that Waldheim knew them, that he wrote about them, that he said, according to the orders of the Fuhrer, the bandits must be captured, and bandits, of course, were partisans, people defending Greece when Hitler invaded Greece. They had to be shot, taken and shot, and others were deported to labor details in Germany, which was death, thousands and thousands of deaths. The point is that the information was available all this time, and nobody sought to look for it. And the second point, of course, is that the Greece activities, Greek activities, and working with the Wehrmacht are documented. And I said at the time that Olof Palme was murdered, that he and Lady Fleming from Greece, who died the same week, would be very familiar with the Greek activities as well as other people. Now, if this is available, where is the documentation on Fritz Kramer, Mr. Fritz Kramer, who came here from Germany, who went to the Battle of the Bulge, who put Henry Kissinger at Harvard, who put Kissinger in charge of Klaus Barbie and Otto Skorzeny and the top Nazis that would be released by the new Senator Joe McCarthy? And also, where are the documents on Joseph Mengele and his genetic experiments? I'll do more, hopefully, next week on that, and the implications of the Mengele story and the Fritz Kramer story and how it's affecting us every day. Now, I didn't get a chance to mention it, but April 18th, 2 weeks ago, Pete Carey won the Pulitzer Prize. He writes for the San Jose Mercury. He won it with two other authors who were working with him, Lewis Simmons and a Catherine Ellison. And Pete won the prize for international reporting that they did last summer on the investigation of Marcos and the flight capital, the money from the Philippines that had been going for the past 20 years out of the country. Now, I gave Pete Carey the Pulitzer Prize several years ago. This is one of these crazy things, but when I read about Frank TERPIL working in California at Stanford Technology, and many of you remember the story, and I called Pete to congratulate him, and I talked to him all the time and laughed about it. I said, look, if Frank TERPIL, the notorious TERPIL, was at Stanford Technology, you have a story here. You can get a Pulitzer Prize. Well, he came down to the house, and the rest is history. I've mentioned it to you many times. David Emery has talked about Pete Carey on KFJC and the relationship to Otto von Bolschwing. But it was when I called Pete, and he came to the house and got about 6 books, and then Nazi Germany, then more, then went into the archives of the newspapers and came out and discovered the notorious Otto von Bolschwing, who was linked to Stanford Technology, and he did a brilliant article, but it was so far ahead of its time. We had so many men and people involved, and women like Helene von Dahm involved in this story, that the powers that be at San Jose Mercury didn't give him a series. If he had followed it straight through and done 3 or 4 articles, I'm positive that he would have won a Pulitzer Prize at the time. But anyway, he won it now and on the Philippines, and that is a really great thing for him to do, along with the other people that he worked with. Just as Robert Herzstein from the University of South Carolina was able to pull out the material on Mr. Waldheim, Kurt Waldheim, research is very important, and this is why I'm emphasizing this to you, because through this research that I'm doing, just as he did with his information in the archives and knew what to look for about Waldheim, I could get to Pete, and we could put together information that, if it hasn't been used properly yet, is invaluable and will be put together if people want to trace and retrace the corporations that Frank TERPIL and Otto von Bolschwing were connected with that are affecting our lives today. Now, I mentioned the new book about Edwin Wilson last week. It's called Manhunt, The Incredible Pursuit of a CIA Agent Turned Terrorist by Peter Moss, Random House, 1986. And there are 2 pages that references to Stanford Technology that are very important. One, chapter 7, how Edwin Wilson met Frank TERPIL in 1975 at a Christmas party. Frank TERPIL's office, and TERPIL worked for the CIA, was a few blocks away from Edwin Wilson's office, and Wilson had worked for the CIA from 1956 on. TERPIL told Wilson he had a really good hook on Gaddafi's first cousin, who handled military procurement, and there were millions to be made. Wilson's office in Washington was a CIA front called Consultants International. Frank TERPIL was working for the CIA selling surveillance devices and had a sales company in California called Intercontinental Technology that was the subsidiary of Stanford Technology. Wilson was impressed with Stanford Technology in the heart of Silicon Valley. It was run by Albert Hakim, Hakim, an Iranian citizen who supplied surveillance for the Shah of Iran's secret police, the Savak. Now, the Savak is identical to Kurt Waldheim's killing the resistance fighters. The Savak is to kill anybody who opposes the regime that was put in by Henry Kissinger and Allen Dulles, the Iranian Shah of Iran, the Pahlavi family with close ties to Nazi Germany. And so continuing from Kurt Waldheim's work in Greece, delivering to the concentration camps and killing the resistance, and Klaus Barbie was under the protection of Henry Kissinger, and he was killing the resistance people in France and in Europe until he went to South America. Now, page 287 of Manhunt says Theodore Shackley was retained as a consultant for Stanford Technology after Edwin Wilson left there and continued working with Albert Hakim, the Iranian, and sending material. And of course, Richard Helms, the former director of the CIA, was over there, and I'll do more and have done a lot on Theodore Shackley, a very, very important man for covert action, private armies, and literally the death squad team, the covert action. So just this new book mentions Stanford Technology twice, and as soon as I read that Frank TERPIL was linked to that, this is when I knew I had that big story. And let me just summarize this again because it's very important. Edwin Wilson latched on and got associated with Frank TERPIL, and because of his links to Stanford Technology, but Edwin Wilson was high up in the CIA, right, with Allen Dulles right from the very beginning. And the interest in common with Stanford Technology. Stanford Technology was a corporation linked into a dummy front put together by Otto von Bolschwing, Adolf Eichmann Superior. He was living in California, in Sacramento, in Silicon Valley, and his secretary, one of the people invested in his company, was Helene von Damm, and she was an interpreter speaking German and translating it while she was the secretary for 8 years to Governor Ronald Reagan. When Reagan went to Washington, Helene von Damm went with him, helped make appointments for the first and second administration, went on to be ambassador to Austria, and is in the company of Kurt Waldheim, the new president of Austria. Edwin Wilson was arrested. He was brought to this country in June 1982 by a man he worked with and knew, Ernest Kaiser, and trusted him. The new book doesn't talk about Ernest von Kaiser having been in the Wehrmacht, but he was accompanied by Kaiser to Dominican Republic and then was arrested and taken to the United States. After Wilson was home and tucked into jail, Mr. Kaiser fled the country in February 1985 and was in Bonn, Germany with Rafi Eitan of the Mossad that I've talked about many times and will do much, much more later on Eitan. And they knew that at that time that Mengele was alive in February 85, and it was that knowledge of theirs plus the scrambling of intelligence operatives after the drug trial cases where various people mentioned having been with Joseph Mengele in drug traffic in South America that caused the Mengele case to be closed as quickly as possible. And I'm going to update for you the Mengele story as soon as I can. Joseph Mengele left Europe with the help of the United States Army. He had worked with the CIA. He went to Argentina. He took his medical records with him. He left Auschwitz in 1945 to do future genetic work. He practiced medicine in Argentina, and he went down there in 1952 with other top Nazis, several of them described in the recent covert action, and I'll reread that. I shared some of that a while back and go back. The important thing is that the connections through history, through the years, put these various characters all together as a network. I'm going to do the second half of this broadcast. We'll take a 1-minute break and then go on to advanced genetic sciences and update that information with you as much as time allows for this week and continue it probably the next week. This is Mae Brussell. It is the second half of broadcast number 752, and I'm going now from Stanford Technology and Edwin Wilson and Frank TERPIL and Otto von Bolschwing and Ronald Reagan to Mr. Ernest Kaiser, who worked with Edwin Wilson and Frank TERPIL. Kaiser familiar with Joseph Mengele from Brazil, his home base, and now I'm going into altering our scientific environment. It is very important. When I talked about AGS before, Advanced Genetic Sciences, I quoted just a page from Anthony Cave Brown's book, The Last Hero, the story of Wild Bill Donovan of the OSS and then the CIA. And in 1948, when the CIA was formed, Donovan got together a group, and they were very busy with biological weapons, to use them as weapons, and they set up studies on biological weapons and groups or installations they would choose to attack, specific applications of psychological warfare, economic warfare, chemical warfare, radiological warfare, and given this mentality, in 1948, with so much on biological warfare, I go to AGS. Now, Time magazine, April 21st, 1986, has a story about genetic engineering. On the front page, where it has the table of contents, page 3, there's a big block. It says science. Critics are blocking biotechnology from breakthroughs. To most scientists, genetic engineering using recombinant DNA techniques, otherwise known as gene splicing, represents no threat to man, beast, or crop and could prove a boon to U.S. farmers. But important experiments outside the laboratory have stymied in court some zealous naysayers led by Washington gadfly Jeremy Rifkin. Now, I'm not going to share the Time magazine because it's in every library and many of you take time. I'll pull out certain details of it, but I want you to see the negativity because Jeremy Rifkin is fighting advanced genetic sciences. I don't know who's behind a lot of the others, Monsanto Chemical, but he's fighting IG Farben, DuPont, Standard Oil, Harvard, Princeton, and the powers that be that will do to us as they have done with their nuclear expertise and make a great disaster of this planet Earth. Now, the LA Times had an article, an editorial, Rifkin against the world, as if Jeremy Rifkin is an enemy of the world. And this is very important, how the major corporations that made Zyklon B, that brought Project Paperclip scientists here, that planned exterminations of masses of people, blacks, Jews, ethnics, through foods and testing and economic and biological warfare, called Rifkin the enemy. And of course, the LA Times, one of the major directors has been Franklin Murphy, a high official in the CIA, and many of their reporters are from the intelligence community. April the 14th, the editorial, Rifkin Against the World, says, there's an epidemic of disease in swine. The disease is caused by a herpes-like virus. It's almost fatal in pigs, and the effect on food supplies is serious. Biologics Corporation in Omaha got a vaccine. To take care of this, the vaccine is genetically engineered. In January, the vaccine was shown to be effective and safe by the EPA. This was the first live product of genetic engineering for use in the environment. The potential benefits were incalculable. The potential risks were non-existent. Remember that with nuclear power, the benefits are incalculable, the risks are non-existent. This is an editorial. This month, it goes on, Jeremy Rifkin, the scourge of biotechnology, complained about environment impact. This same Rifkin has almost single-handedly stymied testing of genetically altered bacteria on plants, even though the bacteria would have the promise of reducing frost damage and increasing crop yield. It had a promise. Rifkin has cleverly used the courts to halt one of the most significant advances of our time. Who is this Rifkin? What are his credentials? He has a long history of opposing things. LA Times reviewers, and they cited them, called his books, these are the quotations on reviewing Rifkin's books, and keep in mind the major corporations and universities and the contracts of billions of dollars to push this through, such as they've pushed other things. A reviewer of his books called it flagrant flim-flam, logical garbage, shameless potpourri of misinformation and faulty logic. I can identify with Rifkin because sleazy people, and I haven't written books, have attacked my articles and research with the same vehemence and anger and dirty. They won't take an issue at a time. They take a generality and will not stand to face a discussion. And because the LA Times had reviews of his books does not mean that the reviewer is right, and doesn't mean that he isn't paid by the corporations that want to make, according to themselves, $100 billion off of these particular techniques. That's how much they want to make. The editorial says, somehow this man has emerged as the single most influential person in the country on genetic engineering. He has finally found an issue on which he can ride. Unfortunately for the rest of us, it is the wrong one. Knowledgeable scientists were right to worry about genetic engineering a decade ago. Now Rifkin's scenario of disaster from unleashed new organisms is groundless. It is time to thank Rifkin for his interest and show him the door. And I think it is time to show the door to IG Farben and DuPont and Roman Haas and the corporations from Belgium and Sweden who are not testing it in Belgium and Sweden but want to test it in the United States. Now, Jeremy Rifkin was able to answer that editorial with an article published in the same newspaper, April 27th, 1986. And I don't very often read almost an entire article, but his words, as he states them, are better than my interpreting them. I outlined many of the material I use, of course, every week. But I'm going to cite what he says because he knows what he's doing, and think of the editorial of that newspaper and the poison it disseminates. The title of his editorial in the Outlook section was, Can Uncle Sam be trusted to police genetic engineering tests? Violations have occurred and mistakes are irreversible. And this is what he says. In the past 2 months, 2 federal agencies were forced to suspend the license of 2 companies engaged in genetic engineering technology. First, Advanced Genetic Sciences, and that's the one that I've been talking about, and particularly being right in Monterey County in my own backyard. They have violated federal laws by falsifying data on pathogenicity tests, and they secretly released genetically altered virus into the environment without securing approval of its own review committee. He said these revelations, first disclosed by his own group, the Foundation on Economic Trends, raises again new questions about the ability of the government to oversee biotechnology and the extent that industry itself can be trusted to police itself if it falsifies data and secretly releases this genetically altered bacteria without anybody knowing it and having to be caught by a few vigilant individuals and snowballing the interest in stopping these activities. He said these actions suggest we should take a step backwards, take a long look at the important issues that have to be addressed in an age of biotechnology. He said every scientific and technological revolution is packaged with benefits and costs. Everybody will benefit in society and we will save money. He said the more powerful the technology and promising immediate economic benefit, the greater becomes the potential for long-term environmental, economic, and social dislocation. Genetic engineering provides civilization with the ultimate form of power over living forces in nature. We have now a technology at our disposal that allows us to begin intervening into the life of genetic blueprints of life. And again, keeping in mind Mr. Joseph Mengele, his genetic experiments, his relationship to Ernest Kaiser, Kaiser to Edwin Wilson and TERPIL, Edwin Wilson TERPIL to von Bolschwing and von Dahm, and the Reinhard Gehlen group, the genetic blueprint to change things is now available for people. He says there are many short-term benefits to be derived from emerging science and technology. However, it is naive and disingenuous to believe that there will be no adverse impact on the environment and on human society. He said in a survey of 127 top scientists, published last December 85 in Science Digest. The respondents acknowledge that the potential of genetic engineering would be beneficial, but they warn, in quotes, it is imprudent or careless that if the use is not right, if they're careless, it could do irreversible devastation and damage to the ecology of the planet. The word is irreversible if people are careless, or if you have an enemy. We worry about Gaddafi having an atomic bomb. What if you have an enemy in a laboratory? And Germany has plenty of enemies. After the Nazis went underground, they could decide to do a lot of harm, just like I think there's enemies in Russia that made sure that they started to have problems with the nuclear plants. He said since World War II, the United States government policy has focused narrowly on the benefits of new science and technological breakthroughs. We have paid little or no attention to long-term environmental, economic, social costs, and innovation. And keep in mind, since World War II, that all the top scientists from the top schools and engineers have put into the military and defense department, and what we have now are microwaves that leak radiation on food, pesticides that cause cancer, and the people that are doing the destructive work for the government are the creme de la creme of the universities that are offered fat salaries that pay for their kindergarten, prep school, college, and graduate work, so they gallop these jobs because they've been in debt since preschool, since they were 3 years old. He said at the beginning of nuclear technology and petrochemical revolution, the government failed to address hard questions concerning potential future to the environment and pollution. As a result, today's children and this generation has to deal with mounting environmental, economic, social bills that range from nuclear waste dumps and acid rain, and now the government wants to have a limit on responsibility if accidents happen, and there's no way to find the money to clean up the waste unless we took it from Star Wars and the Pentagon where it is, but we're putting it into new weapons and not to cleaning it up. He says, now comes genetic engineering, and once again, we fail to develop any coherent framework to assure a proper regard for health and humans and environment. Similar to the petrochemical revolution, now you find genetic engineering, genetically altered bacteria with absolutely no plan, as in the past there was no plan. Now he said this case is visibly apparent in the matter of the 2 licenses that were granted by the federal agencies allowing genetically engineered organisms into the environment. In both cases, the federal government was forced to suspend the licenses in the wake of disclosures detailing violations of federal law. In the first case by AGS, Advanced Genetic Sciences, and the second by the Agricultural Department. And remember, AGS is run locally in Oakland by Mr. Buchart from Belgium, who goes back and forth between Oakland, California, and Belgium, and is not, for all purposes, an American citizen, but is running it from a foreign country. Mr. Jeremy Rifkin went on, the federal government has to establish vigorous oversight and ask the government to deliberate before they release live genetically engineered organisms in the environment. And I suggest for those of you in other states and places that subscribe to this broadcast or hear me on the air, it isn't just the California Representative Leon Panetta who is fighting to stop the release of this material in California, but it's up to you to ask your congressman in your various states, wherever you are, what they're going to do about these living organisms. He goes on, there are important differences between genetically engineered products and petrochemical products, in case we don't know the difference, and he said you have to know the difference. Genetically engineered bacteria and products are alive. They are alive and inherently more unpredictable than chemicals. They interact with other living things. Consequently, it is much more difficult to assess the potential impact than a biotechnical product would have on the Earth's ecosystem. You may stop a pig's disease, but you don't know what you're releasing that will travel and affect other situations at the same time. He says genetically engineered products reproduce. They just don't sit there. They reproduce. They grow. And they migrate. They make more of themselves. They duplicate at a tremendous speed. They grow and get larger, and they don't stay where they are. They move. And like petrochemical products, it is impossible to constrain them in a given geographical location. You can take 1 acre and say we're going to spray it, but the wind blows in Monterey County, goodness knows the wind blows, or anywhere else, in Oakland where the trees were sprayed, and they move and you can't constrain them. And he said there's no such as a geographical locale where it stays. It is virtually impossible to recall living products back into the laboratory, especially that are microscopic in nature. For all these reasons, genetically engineered products pose a much greater long-term potential threat to the environment than petrochemical substances. Every time we choose to introduce a new genetically modified organism into the environment, the potential for damage exists. This is Jeremy Rifkin from the Los Angeles Times, April 27, 1986, who has been fighting to preserve this planet as best he can. He said each year the American continent is ravaged by non-native organisms with destruction to plant and animal life, and he says it costs us billions of dollars. It doesn't save money that these things come here, and he cites gypsy moth and a kudzu vaunt and Dutch elm disease and chestnut blight and starlings and the Mediterranean fruit flies. Now, we had a situation last year that I still want to put on the air and haven't had time, where killer bees were brought to Bakersfield, California, and into Ohio, and there's a belief they came on ships from Brazil into Ohio, but there hasn't been any single explanation on how they came to California. And if they were to take over and destroy the other bees, weaker bees, there would be no cross-pollination, and it would affect the crops and the food supply in the United States. Now, those bees were taken from Africa and brought to Sao Paulo, Brazil, where Joseph Mengele lived, and for all purposes until just recently, Ernest Kaiser knew that he was in Brazil in February of 85. He's not there today, but it's in the laboratories where the great genetic scientists from Auschwitz, who came with Project Paperclip with other genetic people from Auschwitz, to practice and do their medical research for the United States military, and then continued in South America at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and we'll go more back to the AIDS story in Fort Detrick, and the cross-pollination, bringing the killer bee to California, came from Brazil. And it would be a terribly expensive thing if they didn't halt it fast, and in this case they stopped it because with no explanation of how it got here, the next conclusion would have to be bringing it here and sabotaging the crops in California. And I'm just posing again the question, is this a story of AGS going to destroy people and food in the United States and make life here a hazard with the potential of the altered bacteria? Now, Rifkin concludes his article for the LA Times. He said, when a genetically altered organism is released, there is only a small chance it will run amok because, like exotic organisms, it is alien to the environment in which it is being introduced. There is that chance because it was never here before. He said this genetically altered bacteria has been released into an already complex environment which developed its own course, a web of highly synchronized relationships over millions of years. And every time you enter a new synthetic introduction, it's tantamount to playing ecological roulette. Even though there's a small chance it could trigger an environmental explosion, and he doesn't talk about the admission of AGS that it would affect the immune system of people who are sick, just taking the genocidal possibilities, and he talks about the environment. He says if it does, the consequences will be thunderous, and again, the scientist said, irreversible. Industry is expected in the next years, as it has in the past, to introduce thousands of new products, but the genetically altered bacteria are going into the thousands. The laboratories are zooming up and speaking about a $20 or $40 billion industry of genetically altered material put into the environment every year. Industry produced thousands of petrochemical products in the environment in the past years, and he says the sheer statistical probability suggests that a small percentage of genetically engineered organisms will prove dangerous and highly destructive. The long-term impact of thousands and thousands of introductions of genetically modified organisms could well eclipse by any order the magnitude of damage from the release of petrochemical products on the Earth's ecosystem. With biological engineered products, they're living, the damage is not containable, it is irreversible, the destruction will reproduce, the organisms can't be recalled, and that is the danger of going ahead with something that once you let one company know, you will have it in every backyard, everywhere in the United States. Now, accompanying the Outlook section that Jeremy Rifkin wrote about, there was a man from Monsanto Chemical talking about the benefits of manipulating this bacteria. His name is Will Carpenter. I'm not going to share that with you now because I want to do more on AGS, but I will go into what he says as a defense coming from a corporation that stands to make billions of dollars from administering this into the environment. He doesn't address the issues that Rifkin talks about. He has his own shtick from the point of the corporations, and he tells it to you. Now, March 28th, 1986, there was a letter to the editor in the LA Herald, and it is symbolic of what has happened in the past years to this country, coming over from Nazi Germany and paperclip the scientists there and the American scientists who loved their studies and brought them to the United States. It led to the editor titled, "Professor Should Practice What He Preaches," about CIA research. And it's about a professor from Harvard University, and Mr. Bogorard, one of the top directors of AGS, is the head of the biology at Harvard University, coincidentally. Herbert Kelman, Kelman, discussed guidelines of the CIA working on campus and making it perfectly proper for them to work in the academic world. And this person reminded people who read the Herald that this writer, Mr. Kelman, has an obligation to reveal who he works for, and CIA people on campus should reveal who they work for. And they cited that Mr. Kelman, the man defending the CIA on campus, Kelman seems to have violated his own ethical canon by saying your background should be available, by failing to report his own receipt of funds from a notorious CIA operation which was exposed September 1st, 1977 in the Boston Globe. Dr. Herbert Kelman admitted just in 1986 that he got funds from a grant of the Human Ecology, no, pardon me, it's 1977 when he admitted, he got funds from a grant from the Human Ecology Fund. And I bring it up because ecology is preserving society. The Human Ecology Fund, which came out at the time of after the Watergate hearings, he said that he didn't know until recently was a conduit of the CIA, but it was a $25 million program on mind control and human behavior designated as the MK Ultra. Some of you remember that and some of you don't. But the MK Ultra was a plan to destroy the minds of people in this country. And the point is that a professor from Harvard University got funds from the CIA and what you think is environmental protection or human ecology. When Jeremy Rifkin wants to protect the ecology, it's different than the millions of dollars that you taxpayers put $25 million into destroying the minds and bodies. So when you take intelligence communities with budgets of billions of dollars and you change the names, like Secretary of Defense is the Secretary of War, what you get is the CIA at Harvard. Well, why couldn't the CIA put money into Mr. Beauregard or Mr. Naylor or to Princeton, as they do at Harvard, and into AGS and into their overseas operations? Why wouldn't the CIA? Well, I cited William Colby, the CIA director, who talked about too many millions of Mexicans, and sure enough, the Mexicans are the farm workers that would be working out in the field that would be handling this particular material. So this letter, just a simple letter to the editor, shows that Mr. Kelman has served on many boards. He's received money over the years from federal agencies. He's on many projects, and that he is from the Central Intelligence Agency, worked with MK Ultra, and has not been removed from any position. Even though the hearings came out, he continues writing to the Herald, writing letters to the editor, and has a position of power which uses titles that are false to hurt us physically and psychologically and cause many deaths. MK Ultra caused more deaths than Gaddafi has caused with his own terrorism. Now, I want to just cite an article that was in the San Francisco Examiner, March 26. We just have a little bit of time. It's about a director of advanced genetic sciences, Douglas Serojak, Serojak, of AGS, who's standing at a chart identical to the way Caspar Weinberger stands at the chart of Grenada or the Gulf of Citra. And the title of the article is Biotech's Firm Stock is Up Despite EPA Controversy. Now, the gist of this article is that even though we were caught, we're going to do well. I'm confident that AGS will do fine, and you know with the background of AGS and the companies I mentioned that they will do fine. But the point is that Douglas Serojak of AGS is talking to a group, and the group that he's talking to, that he's been invited to speak with, is the Commonwealth Club in California. That's a very prestigious group like the World Affairs Council in San Francisco. And the meeting that he's having, the luncheon meeting or the group, is with the Commonwealth Club in California. Now, the Commonwealth Club is the exact club where William Colby, the CIA director, is trying to tell you we have to get rid of 30 or 40 million Mexicans. That's his subject of his speech. The world is overpopulated with Mexicans. Well, there's 20 to 30 Africans that have AIDS, and I just wonder how much of a coincidence is that the Commonwealth Club entertains a genocidal man, and almost every one of their guests has a potential genocide connection to the hanky-panky that's going on around the world, but they have entertained William Colby with the idea of destroying 30 to 40 million Mexicans he's talking about. And then when AGS is under fire for breaking regulations and for the potential to do harm, Douglas Serojak is giving his little speech and praising his corporation. The article that was in the San Francisco Examiner says AGS was punished by the Environmental Protection Agency for unauthorized open-air tests recently of genetically altered bacteria, but Mr. Serojak says this is only a temporary setback. We will weather the controversy. They falsified research reports on the gene splicing. They were reprimanded, but he said there's almost 200 biotechnology firms in the Bay Area alone, and he said this concern, it was raised on how small companies will deal with regulatory agencies. Well, AGS is not a small company, with people on the head of the biology department at Harvard and at Princeton with Roman Haas, and DuPont and IG, their connections, IG Farben and Standard Oil, and the international Belgium and Swedish connections. He refers, we're just a little company, and look what you're doing to us, but we'll bounce back. And the whole image, you're coming down on a little company who wants to help society, is a bunch of hogwash. The article says the Cetus Corporation in Emeryville, California, is doing genetics. The Environmental Protection Agency is helping the biotechnology industry. There are regulations, and they are using them, and it was wrong to have sprayed in Castroville. It was wrong to have sprayed in California the past 10 months, actually, pardon me. But he says, we'll work on it, and we'll clean up our act. And Serojak is the marketing director as he lectured to the Commonwealth Club. This was March 15th, 1986, with full confidence of the Environmental Protection Agency. The editor of Medical Technology Stock Letter said there is money in this kind of business, and when you suspend and hurt the businesses, you delay testing, and we have to get the product to the market. Again, the money. The Wall Street Journal reacted to AGS and said the shares went down at first, but then it went way up. They have a good public relations firm they have hired. I cited the name on the air about 4 months ago, and now even if the stock goes down, they are swinging in the big chips, and they're ready to continue. John Bedbrook, Vice President Director of the Research of AGS, says the suspension will delay us only 3 months, but it won't be long before frost ban will be very lucrative. It'll be on the market, and they intend, now listen to this, the long-term outlook is a $100 billion industry within 9 years. By 1995, $100 billion in growth hormones, altered products, genetically altered products. Now, can you believe if they're spending $400 million by 1987 in biotechnology, that $100 billion, that the planet Earth can be protected or even survive, given the accident ability or the sabotage or the group of the Fourth Reich to pollute or poison us? Can you see what Mr. Rifkin is talking about, the chances of error? One strawberry leaf sprayed isn't going to kill you, me, or anybody, but a $100 billion industry in 1995 is horrendous. Forget the atomic problems in the atomic plant in the Soviet Union. Start looking in the United States and see what is happening to us as people, to our food, what we're going to eat, the air, what they're letting out of the laboratory, and trace it back to Auschwitz and Mengele and the Fuhrer and the Kurt Waldheims and the Mengeles, and see how America is used and abused and what is going to happen to us. I am out of time now, but I'm going to continue on AGS next week because it is terribly important. And when Rifkin gets the attention of Time Magazine and editorials, they're beginning to put the heat and squeeze, and we have to defend him and study what he's doing and fight for our own health and safety and appreciate the efforts that some people are making to call attention to those things. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week, and as I say, to continue hopefully along these lines.